The peoples of West Papua and Torres Straits are also our Melanesian brothers and sisters. And for other Melanesian peoples who are still colonized, as they compound the ongoing violations they are already enduring due to their independent political status.
Friends, welcome to the Manuskrip Papua YouTube channel.
Selamat datang di channel YouTube Manuskrip Papua. Teman-teman, Mahkamah Internasional ICJ, Badan Peradilan Utama Perserikatan Bangsa-Bangsa, mengadakan sidang dengar pendapat publik atas konsultasi tentang kewajiban negara-negara terkait perubahan iklim. Acara ini diadakan dari tanggal 2 hingga tanggal 13 Desember tahun 2024 di Den Haag, tempat kedudukan Mahkamah Internasional ICJ. Sidang diadakan di bawah pimpinan Hakim Nawaf Salam, Presiden Pengadilan. Sidang ini mendengarkan pernyataan lisan dari Vanuatu dan Melanesian Spearhead Group bersama Afrika Selatan, Albania, dan Jerman. Nomor kasus sidang ini, 187 tentang konsultasi perubahan iklim. Dalam sidang ini, perwakilan Vanuatu atas nama MSG secara resmi bicara di ICJ bahwa hak penentuan nasib sendiri bagi orang Melanesia di West Papua tidak bisa dilupakan. Vanuatu juga berkonsentrasi penuh atas hak penentuan nasib sendiri bagi orang Melanesia di West Papua. Menanggapi isu ini, Sebi Sambom Jubir Komnas TPNPB melalui rilis resminya pada tanggal 6 Desember tahun 2024 menyampaikan bahwa bangsa Papua siap bawa Indonesia ke ICJ atas kejahatan dan pelanggaran hukum atas aneksasi Papua Barat dan sedang melakukan pendudukan ilegal di Papua Barat. Salam hormat dari saya YouTuber Manuskrip Papua. Jangan lupa komen wajib sopan. Manuskrip.
2, 1. I now give the floor to the representative of Vanuatu and the Melanesian Spearhead Group, and I invite Mr. Ralph Regenvanu to the podium. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the Court, good morning. It is with a profound sense of urgency and responsibility that I stand before you today representing the Republic of Vanuatu and the Melanesian Spearhead Group in these historic proceedings. The outcome of these proceedings will reverberate across generations, determining the fate of nations like mine and the future of our planet. Vanuatu is a nation of islands and island peoples. Our peoples have built vibrant cultures and traditions over millennia that are intimately intertwined with our ancestral lands and seas. Yet today, we find ourselves on the front lines of a crisis we did not create. A crisis that threatens our very existence and that of so many other peoples who have come in unprecedented numbers to be heard by this court. The importance of the questions before this court cannot be overstated. At issue in this case is the legality under the entire corpus of international law of a certain conduct displayed by specific states over time, which has interfered with the climate system to a point that has already resulted in injury to Vanuatu and that threatens the survival of my people and of humanity as a whole. The General Assembly, acting by consensus, defined this conduct in clear terms. First, in question A, the General Assembly refers to, and I quote, anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, end quote. As stated in the 2023 synthesis report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and I quote, human activities, principally through emissions of greenhouse gases, have unequivocally caused global warming, end quote. This is not only a statement of the global scientific consensus. It was also adopted line by line with the consensus of all states, including all those present in these proceedings. The unprecedented risks created by anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions have been known since at least the 1960s, as detailed in our written submissions. Indeed, in an address of the 8th of February 1965, then US President Lyndon Johnson identified the problem in the clearest terms, and I quote, this generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through radioactive materials and a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels, end quote. Second, the General Assembly specifically referred in preambular paragraph 5 of Resolution 77/276 to, and I quote, conduct of states over time in relation to activities that contribute to climate change and its adverse effects, end quote. The conduct on trial here is that of states, which have failed for over a century, despite increasingly dire warnings, to rein in the emissions from their territories. I must emphasize that since 1990, emissions have increased by over 50%, reaching an all-time high in 2023 last year. More than half of all CO2 emissions since 1750 were emitted after 1990. Whatever the time frame, there is no excuse. Third, a handful of readily identifiable states have produced the vast majority of historic and current greenhouse gas emissions. Yet other countries, including my own, are suffering the brunt of the consequences. The IPCC has recognized this climate injustice, stating, and I quote, "Vulnerable communities who have historically contributed the least to current climate change are disproportionately affected," end quote. The definition of the relevant conduct in question B thus reflects the beating heart of this request, when it asks the court to determine the legal consequences arising for states whose, and I quote, "acts and omissions have caused significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment," end quote. The question is therefore simple at its core. Having regard to their obligations under international law, have those states responsible for climate change acted lawfully? Vanuatu's position is clear. The conduct responsible for this crisis is unlawful under a range of international obligations, including those explicitly mentioned in Resolution 77/276. This is a legal case, and as the court will know from the written submissions, we are far from being alone in making it. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, our delegation has just returned from the recent COP29 in Baku, where we witnessed firsthand, once again, the failure of the process. It is unconscionable that the COP failed to reach any agreement on cutting emissions. The current emission reduction commitments of states, even if fully respected, will see a catastrophic increase in temperature. For many people, including in Vanuatu, the prolonged and systematic failure of the COP process has cost them their well-being, their cultures, and even their lives. There is an urgent need for a collective response to climate change grounded not in political convenience, but in international law. The court, as the principal organ of the United Nations, is uniquely positioned to provide authoritative guidance regarding the entire corpus of international law. We look to the court for recognition that the conduct which has already caused immense harm to my people and so many others is unlawful, that it must cease, and that its consequences must be repaired. In closing, I choose my words carefully when I say that this may well be the most consequential case in the history of humanity. Let us not allow future generations to look back and wonder why the cause of their doom was condoned. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, I will be followed today by 6 speakers on behalf of the Republic of Vanuatu and the Melanesian Spearhead Group. First will be Vanuatu's Attorney General, Mr. Arno Lofman, who will emphasize the need for this court to apply international law to the conduct responsible for climate change. Second will be Mr. Ilan Kiloi, who will introduce the Melanesian Spearhead Group and discuss the harms that climate change has already caused to the states and people of Melanesia. Third will be Mr. Julian Aguan, who will demonstrate that the conduct responsible for climate change has infringed the rights to self-determination of Melanesian people. Fourth, Professor Jorge Vinuales will explain that this same conduct violates the duties of due diligence, prevention of significant harm to the environment, and the protection and preservation of the marine environment. Next, Professor Margareta Wiwarenke Singh will discuss the legal consequences resulting from state conduct that breaches these and other rules of international law. And finally, Ms. Cynthia Hunuhi will share the impacts of climate change on the youth of present and future generations throughout Melanesia. I thank you for the honor of addressing you. And I now request, Mr. President, the court to call Mr. Lofman. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Vanu. I now give the floor to Mr. Arnold Lugman. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, as the Attorney General of Vanuatu, my foremost duty is to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law. Our Constitution is a governance with our people guaranteeing fundamental rights and freedoms and committing to the protection of our way of life for present and future generations. Our Constitution also establishes our sovereignty, which we retained in 1980, following more than a century of colonial rule. Yet I stand here before you with a heavy heart. The rights enshrined in our Constitution are being undermined. and not from within, but from the acts and omissions of certain states beyond our borders. We know what the cause of climate change is: a conduct of specific states, which, as explained by Mr. Regan Vanu, Special Envoy. Vanuatu's contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions is negligible, and yet we are among those most affected by climate change. As the principal legal officer of my country, I have come before this court because domestic legal remedies are unable to address a crisis of this scope and magnitude. I have come to ask you to uphold the rule of law. Under international law, states have obligations. Obligation to act with due diligence, to prevent significant harm to the environment, to reduce the emissions and provide support to countries like mine, to protect the human rights of present and future generations, to protect and preserve marine environment, and to respect the fundamental rights of my people to self-determination in our own land. The failure by a small number of large emitting states to fulfill these obligations constitutes an internationally wrongful act, triggering legal consequences under the international law of state responsibility. Each of these states, which are identified on the basis of reliable scientific evidence in Vanuatu submission, has individually caused significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment. Together, they have caused catastrophic harm in the form of climate change and its adverse effects. In a system intended to uphold peace and security, self-determination, the enjoyment of fundamental rights and protection of the environment, how can the conduct that has taken humanity to the brink of catastrophe, threatening the survival of entire peoples, be lawful and without consequences? We urge the court to affirm in the clearest terms that this conduct is in breach of the obligations of states under international law, and that such breach carries legal consequences. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, the stakes could not be higher. The survival of my people and so many others is on the line. We trust in the wisdom of this court to uphold the principles of international law. Thank you for your attention. I would now kindly ask you, Mr. President, to call upon Mr. Ilan Kiloi to take the floor. Thank you, Tomas.
I thank Mr. Lugman. I now give the floor to Mr. Ilan Kiloi. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, I have the honor to address you this morning on behalf of the Melanesian Spearhead Group, MSG, which brings together the Republic of Fiji, the independent state of Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and the Kanak Socialist Liberation Movement of New Caledonia, FLNKS. New Caledonia is a non-self-governing territory, and the FLNKS represents the indigenous Melanesian Kanak people. The peoples of West Papua and Torres Straits are also our Melanesian brothers and sisters. Melanesia is a tapestry of diverse people, each with their own rich cultures, languages, and traditions. But we also share, in the words of Melanesian philosopher Bernard Narakobi, a common cultural and spiritual unity, stemming from our interconnectedness with our environment. We are place persons, which means we are the places. We are the landscapes. We are the waters, and we are the soils, the stones, and we are the flora and the fauna. We are the weather, the seasons, and the spirits of our ancestral territories. Yet now, across our sea of islands, anthropogenic climate change has imperiled our people's physical survival and ripped apart the integral relationships between people and place that grounds our very existence. Simply put, climate change has unraveled the fabric of our very lives. As the court knows, we have submitted 35 testimonies from across communities in Melanesia. These testimonies contain the stories and the realities of our fathers, our mothers, and our children. Through these testimonies, our people share the sacred knowledge, their sacrifice, and their sufferings, and their grief. In return, they ask only that we bring their voices here to this great hall of justice, so that the court can understand what they are going through and how much they have lost. We respectfully ask the court to read the testimonies of our people with great care to better understand what climate change means for them, including the concrete impacts on their right to self-determination. Self-determination is at the heart of MSG mission. Each of MSG states emerged from colonial rule less than 50 years ago. Yet, climate change is now robbing our peoples from their hard-won self-determination. Melanesian peoples have been deprived of their means of subsistence, lost their territories, and suffered the collapse of their self-determined governance systems, economies, and cultures. These losses represent severe violation of their right to self-determination. Such violation is especially devastating for Kanak people and for other Melanesian peoples who are still colonized, as they compound the ongoing violations they are already enduring due to their independent political status. Non-self-governing peoples lack the ability to control their responses to climate change, or indeed even to appear before this honorable court. MSG is proud to count FLNKs amongst its membership and to bring the otherwise unheard voices of the colonized people to these important proceedings. More generally, the injustice of the climate crisis is inseparable from our shared colonial histories. The majority of the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to the conduct of a few readily identifiable states, some of which colonized and exploited the land, the resources, and the peoples of Melanesia. We have not yet recovered from the enduring violence and colonization has inflicted on us as we struggle to rebuild and assert ourselves within a system we do not create. Climate change is now depriving our peoples again of our ability to enjoy our right to self-determination in our land. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, and members of the court, the harsh reality is that many of our peoples will not survive. The conduct responsible for this existential harm cannot, and I repeat, cannot be lawful under international law. In closing, MSG joins Vanuatu in asking the court to affirm that this conduct is unlawful, with ensuing legal consequences. I thank you for your courtesy and attention. Mr. President, I respectfully request that you now call Mr. Julian Angon to the podium. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Kilaway. I now give the floor to Mr. Julian Angon. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court. The right to self-determination is a cornerstone of the international legal order. This court has characterized self-determination as both an essential principle of contemporary international law and as a fundamental human right with a broad scope of application. Its realization is, to quote the UN Human Rights Committee, an essential condition for the effective guarantee and observance of individual human rights and for the promotion and strengthening of those rights. The right to self-determination gives rise to obligations of an erga omnes character. The right is also widely recognized as a peremptory norm of international law. Self-determination guarantees the right of all peoples to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. It also encompasses their rights to maintain their territorial integrity and permanent sovereignty over their natural resources. Yet, the conduct responsible for climate change has already infringed on the right to self-determination for the many peoples of Melanesia. Over time and generations, the peoples of Melanesia have self-determined, developing sophisticated systems of governance, economies, cultures, and cosmologies, grounded in the intimate relationship between each people and their place. The well-established adverse effects of climate change have caused a total collapse of these self-determined ways of life. Melanesian peoples have already suffered forced dislocations from their traditional territories, loss of natural resources essential for both cultural and physical subsistence, breakdown of political systems and means of self-governance, and rupture of relationships to the cosmos. In short, they have lost nearly everything that has, since time immemorial, formed their very essence as peoples. In its written submissions, MSG has cataloged these horrors in great detail by way of testimonies collected from communities across Melanesia, including, but not limited to, the Uwara tribe of New Caledonia, the people of Veribari village in Papua New Guinea, the villagers of Vuni Dongaloa, Fiji, the people of Malaita province, Solomon Islands, and the people of Yakel village, Vanuatu. These testimonies unequivocally demonstrate that the conduct responsible for climate change has already caused grievous violations of the right to self-determination of peoples across this sub-region. The same is true at the level of sovereign states. In Vanuatu, for instance, unrelenting natural disasters have flung the nation into a near-constant state of emergency. The Sisyphean task of responding to climate disasters has left the country simply unable to pursue its aspirations for sustainable development and has forced the government to take on substantial debt, thereby inducing dependency. These constraints, together with the degradation and destruction of the nation's natural resources, sharply curtail Vanuatu's ability to self-govern and freely determine its economic, social, and cultural development. Worse is yet to come. Rising sea levels are projected to submerge the entire territory of certain small island states, possibly within decades. This would inhibit the sovereignty of these states and thus the right of the affected peoples to fully enjoy their self-determined political status. It would also force the dispersal of peoples from their ancestral homelands, undermining their right to exist as integral peoples within their own territory, which this court stated in its most recent advisory opinion on the occupied Palestinian territory is protected by the right to self-determination. For the peoples of Melanesia, whose very existence as peoples is fused with their ancestral territories, this would be tantamount to collective death. No participant in these proceedings has disputed these facts. However, one has argued that these harms do not implicate individual state obligations. Another has contended that the right of self-determination was not designed to address climate change. These arguments miss the point. While the right to self-determination has a clear normative core, that is, the right of peoples to determine their own fate, this does not make it a static norm. In fact, the opposite is true, as preserving that core requires the application of the norm in factual situations where that right is most at risk. Indeed, the conduct at issue in this case profoundly undermines the most core aspects of the self-determination right. All states are obligated to respect the right to self-determination by refraining from any conduct that infringes on the right. The conduct at issue in this case has caused violations of the right to self-determination, violations which were foreseeable. States engaged in this conduct have thus breached their obligations to respect the right to self-determination, triggering distinct legal consequences. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, this matter strikes at the very heart of international law. Self-determination enjoys more liberatory heft than any other single norm of international law. Yet, the reality is that the conduct of a handful of states has caused severe, systemic, and sustained violations of this right. The legal framework is robust, but still requires your affirmation to translate principles into practice. We urge this court to reaffirm the rule of law and protect the right of all peoples to self-determination. In closing, throughout these proceedings, we have taken great care to accurately describe the peoples and cultures of Melanesia, even though we are aware that most aspects of those same cultures are difficult to translate into any of the languages officially recognized by this court. But we have done so because, as surely as these peoples deserve to live in the world on their own terms, so too do they deserve to be heard here. The peoples of Melanesia live exceptionally close to the earth and thus feel the vandalism visited upon it acutely. Moreover, theirs represents living, breathing, alternative imaginations, imaginations other than the one that has brought this planet to the brink of ecological collapse. Thus, ensuring they are able to live and thrive in their ancestral spaces is of the utmost importance, and not only for themselves, but for all of humanity. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, thank you for your attention. Mr. President, I now respectfully call upon you to invite Professor Jorge Vinuales to the podium.
I thank Mr. Agun. I now give the floor to Professor Jorge Vinuales. You have the floor, Professor.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, for over 170 years, a handful of states have contributed the overwhelming majority of greenhouse gas emissions, the cause of climate change. For much of this period, international law has required states to act with due diligence to ensure that their territory is not used in a way that significantly harms others, to prevent significant harm to the environment, which includes the climate system, and to protect and preserve the marine environment. From the Alabama claims arbitration and the Trail Smelter arbitration to this court's Corfu Channel case, its advisory opinion on the legality of nuclear weapons, and its subsequent decisions, most recently in the Silala case. These obligations of due diligence and prevention have been recognized as a core requirement of state conduct. Specifically, in 1996, the court confirmed, and I quote, the existence of the general obligation of states to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction and control respect the environment of other states or of areas beyond national control is now part of the corpus of international law relating to the environment. End of quote. Prevention is a cornerstone of international environmental law, and it is a general application. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea has recalled in its advisory opinion of May 2024 that the principle of prevention is a source of the obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights, in an advisory opinion of 2017, likewise referred to the obligations of states to prevent significant environmental damage within and outside their territory as a foundation of the rights to life and integrity. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change expressly confirms, at paragraph 8 of its preamble, the application of the prevention principle to anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases. The obligations of due diligence and prevention are therefore central to the present proceedings. In Resolution 77-276, the General Assembly, acting by consensus, requested the Court to have particular regard to, and I quote, the duty of due diligence, the principle of prevention of significant harm to the environment, and the duty to protect and preserve the marine environment, end of quote. Later, in formulating question B, the General Assembly used the terminology of prevention when asking what are the legal consequences of the acts and omissions of certain states which, I quote, have caused significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment. The Court will therefore have to clarify what were the main contributors to climate change required to do to comply with their due diligence and prevention obligations. In the Palm Mills case, the Court answered a similar question in the following terms, and I quote, "A state is obligated to use all the means at its disposal in order to avoid activities which take place in its territory or in any area under its jurisdiction, causing significant damage to the environment of another state." The climate system is, of course, both within and beyond the jurisdiction of affected states, and in any event, the obligation of prevention also protects the environment of areas beyond national control. In the specific context of climate change, exercising the requisite due diligence entails, according to the IPCC, rapid and deep, and in most cases, immediate greenhouse gas emission reductions in all sectors this decade, end of quote. The main source of emissions is the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. The International Energy Agency found in a flagship report of 2021 that reaching net zero emissions by 2050 requires that no new oil, gas, or coal projects are approved beyond those committed in 2021. Thus, when it comes to activities that significantly contribute to climate change, the required conduct was and is clear. States which have significantly contributed to climate change were and are required to achieve deep cuts of their greenhouse gas emissions, as well as of their production of fossil fuels. But they have not. For decades, what we have seen from large emitting and producing states is delay, low ambition, and in practice, concrete plans to expand the extraction and use of fossil fuels. In other words, the exact opposite of the due diligence that was and is required from them. This is not a matter of degree. The contrast between word and deed is stark. Large emitting and producing states are proactively expanding the fossil fuel production and consumption, paying lip service to their climate commitments. Vanuatu has substantiated this claim in great detail, both empirically and legally, in its written submissions. But it is useful to recall some figures. Since 1990, emissions of greenhouse gases have increased by more than 50%. The highest annual emissions ever recorded were, well, in 2023. And figures for 2024 are not yet available. According to the International Monetary Fund, the cost of fossil fuel subsidies from states reached an all-time high of $7 trillion in 2022. That is more than 23 times the figure that developing countries struggled to secure as climate finance in the recent COP29. The 2023 edition of the Production Gap Report from the UN Environment Programme, befittingly titled Facing Down or Facing Up, with interrogation marks, captures the essence of the problem. Looking at 20 large state emitters, it concludes, and I quote, while 17 of the 20 countries profiled have pledged to achieve net zero emissions, and many have launched initiatives to reduce emissions from fossil fuel production activities, most continue to promote subsidize, support, and plan on the expansion of fossil fuel production. End of quote. That would lead, according to the UNEP, to global production levels in 2030 that are 460%, 29%, and 82% higher for coal, oil, and gas, respectively. As I said earlier, lip service to climate commitments. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the Court, such a deliberate level of subsidies and inaction attributable to specific states over a long period of time in full knowledge of the catastrophic effects for humans and the environment, at least since the 1960s, amounts to a serious violation of states' obligations to act with due diligence, prevent significant harm to the environment, and protect and preserve the marine environment. To echo the words of Attorney General Lockman, how could this deliberate conduct be consistent with international law? Major emitters and producers, in the written submissions, have tried to hide behind the enormity of the problem, overstating the complexity of the legal question. Yet, if an isolated incident of transboundary pollution is unlawful, it is unthinkable that the ultimate form of pollution is not. It would be like accepting the tragic irony famously noted by Raphael Lemkin that murder is unlawful, but genocide is not. Thank you for your attention, Mr. President. I now respectfully request that you call Professor Margareta Wawrinka-Singh to the podium.
I thank Professor Vinaraos, and now give the floor to Professor Margareta Wawrinka-Singh. Professor, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the Court. Ubi jus, ibi remedium. Where there is a right, there is a remedy in breach. The conduct concerned in this case violates international law. The Court has been asked to articulate the legal consequences of these violations. As a majority of participants have stressed, these legal consequences are governed by the general law of state responsibility. This is confirmed by the explicit reference to legal consequences in question B of the request, and it is also clear from the use in both the English and French texts of the exact terminology of Article 42 of the International Law Commission's articles on the responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts. Remarkably, a few participants have argued that the law of state responsibility cannot be effectively applied to climate change. But the opposite is true. Acts such as issuing licenses for fossil fuel exploration and extraction, or granting massive fossil fuel subsidies, as well as omissions, such as the failure to regulate emissions, or to provide finance as required under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, are plainly conduct that is attributable to states under the general rule codified in Article 4 of the ILC articles. The nature of the breach is also captured in all its complexity by the rule in Article 15. This rule concerns breaches arising from a composite act, understood as, and I quote, a series of actions or omissions defined in the aggregate as wrongful, end quote. Furthermore, Article 47 confirms that when multiple states have displayed the same wrongful conduct, the responsibility of each may be invoked. The suggestion that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change or the Paris Agreement replaces these secondary rules is, simply put, wrong. Indeed, it has already been dismissed implicitly or explicitly by courts around the world, including recently by the European Court of Human Rights, whose judgment in Klima Signorinen versus Switzerland expressly relies on Article 47 of the ILC articles, affirming that states can be held internationally responsible for violations stemming from their contributions to climate change. Likewise, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea confirmed in its advisory opinion of May 2024 that international responsibility attaches where a state breaches its climate-related obligations under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, distinguished members of the Court, this Court is called upon to affirm a similar, yet even more fundamental point, that a state which, by its acts and omissions, has caused significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment has thereby breached international law, and that in the ordinary way, the general law of state responsibility governs the legal consequences of that breach. The Court must not be silent on this crucial point. Silence risks implying that international law condones this conduct, that it carries no legal consequences, and that it can continue with impunity. As we all know, the legal consequences for such internationally wrongful conduct are well established. First, responsible states must cease the wrongful conduct. What does this mean? In our submission, this means not only stopping actions that fuel the fire, such as expanding and providing subsidies for fossil fuels, but also dismantling the systemic structures that drive emissions. It requires a suite of regulatory measures capable of achieving immediate and deep emission cuts, bearing in mind that the obligation of cessation is not fulfilled until a responsible state actually ceases to cause further harm. Second, as several participants have highlighted, assurances of non-repetition must be provided, including effective safeguards against false solutions that risk aggravating the harm, such as geoengineering. Third, reparations. While some participants cite difficulties establishing a causal link between wrongful conduct and specific injury, as if making reparations impossible, others rightly point out that attribution science can establish such links with great precision. More importantly, however, the Court does not need to identify a source-specific causal link to clarify the content of reparations as a legal consequence. The cardinal principle is crystal clear. Responsible states are required to make full reparation for the injury they have caused. How is this given effect in this case? In our submission, responsibility for reparations can and must be proportionate to historic contributions to the harm. As the Supreme Court of the Netherlands held in the Urgenda case, an underlying principle of Article 47 of the ILC articles is that, and I quote, partial fault also justifies partial responsibility, end quote. Examples, such as the Climate Superfund Act passed by the state of Vermont in the United States earlier this year, show that holding specific polluters accountable for climate damages is not only possible in theory, but achievable in practice. We urge the court to ensure that international law is given full force in this context. Restitution is, of course, the primary form of reparations, and there is ample scope for restitution in its ordinary understanding. For instance, ecosystem restoration is possible, at least to some extent, and responsible states must make every effort to achieve and support it. For harms that cannot be undone, monetary compensation is due. The court's express recognition of this obligation is critical in a context where the burden of addressing losses and damages in practice remains on those injured. The financial mechanisms established in international negotiations have not changed this reality. And as a matter of law, their establishment in no way negates or replaces the obligation of compensation arising from breaches of international law. Satisfaction is required to repair spiritual, dignitary, and other aspects of the injury that cannot be cured through restitution or compensation. It should cover a wide range of measures, including acknowledgement of the harm and commemorations and tributes to the victims. The participatory rights of children and youth who occupy a proximate position to future generations merit special regard in this context. The recognition of the unlawful character of the relevant conduct is also an important form of satisfaction, consistent with the court's practice. Fourth and finally, due to the peremptory nature of the right to self-determination and the erga omnes character of relevant obligations, the breach triggers additional obligations for all states and international organizations. Specifically, states and international organizations must not recognize the unlawful situation resulting from the breach. A concrete implication is the obligation to recognize the territory and maritime spaces of small island developing states as established under the law of the sea and their continued sovereignty and statehood despite the effects of climate change. All states and international organizations must also cooperate to bring the breach to an end. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, the law of state responsibility serves as international law's foundation. It ensures that no state is above the law, that violations have consequences, that rights do indeed come with remedies for victims. The magnitude of climate change and the severity of the harm already suffered underscore the urgency of applying these fundamental principles now, in these proceedings, with full force. I thank you for your careful attention. And, Mr. President, I now kindly ask you to invite Mrs. Cynthia Huniui, a representative of the youth, to the floor to conclude the oral submissions on behalf of the Republic of Vanuatu and the Melanesian Spearhead Group.
I thank Professor Marin Singh. I now give the floor to Ms. Cynthia Huniuni. Madam, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court. My name is Cynthia Rosa Barianga Haka Honiuhi. I am from Makira and South Malaita in the Solomon Islands. Within my blood flows the collective memory of my ancestors, Huta'a, who were conceived from the divine law, Warato'o, and have thrived on our islands since time immemorial. I stand before you not as an individual, but as the living embodiment of the voices of our people, past, present, and future. I also have the honor to address you as President of the Pacific Islands Students Fighting Climate Change, the youth organization that began the campaign to bring climate change before you. 5 years ago, I was one of those students who together dreamed up a plan to seek an advisory opinion from this court and brought that dream to the government of Vanuatu. 29 years ago, when this court considered the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, a Masalis mother stood where I'm standing now, Lee John Eknilang. She was a survivor of the US nuclear weapons testing program, which unleashed 67 nuclear weapons upon her homeland and her people. She appeared before this court to share the grave injustice inflicted upon her life, her nation, and our region, all in the spirit of contributing to the vision of a peaceful and better world. I am here to do the same. For my people, our land, Mako, is the most precious. Land is our mother, a living, timeless plane where generations past, present, and future converge, interconnected, and sustained in an unbroken cycle of life. It is upon our land that our values and principles are rooted, preserved, and transmitted across generations. Our land stretches to the distant waters where the Sak Paiawa swims, rises to the heights where the eagle Huara soars, spans the rivers traversed by the crocodile Huara, and reaches into the depths of soil where the snake Moa burrows. For my Are people, the birthright custodians, Reoni Mai Noni, walk in sync with our clan totems, Reoni Mai, they safeguard the fundamental relationship with the divine law, Warato'o, land, Mako, and people, Noni. My people understand the continuous duty of past and present generations to protect the environment for the future generations, Kiramo. It is the adherence to this duty that enabled my people to live and thrive in harmony with our environment. This duty, Arata Inoni o Anaha, is our understanding of the legal principle of intergenerational equity. Climate change is undermining our ability to uphold this sacred contract. My people's land of Vanalei is nearing a critical point on the verge of being completely engulfed by the rising seas. Without our land, our bodies and memories are severed from the fundamental relationship that defined who we are. Those who stand to lose are the future generations. Their future is uncertain, reliant upon the decision-making of a handful of large emitting states which, as my colleagues explained, are responsible for climate change. These states have not only enabled, but proactively encouraged the production and consumption of fossil fuels and continue to do so today. When the Paris Agreement was concluded, the youth of the world looked up to it as an instrument of hope. Today, the entire COP process has been hijacked by large emitters and major fossil fuel producers, turning it into a polluter-safe harbor and a trap for everyone else. No good faith understanding of the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement can be consistent with the conduct of large emitters. By depriving the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and COP process of any good faith, meaning these states have turned all three against their spirit. For my people, and for the world's youth and future generation, the consequences are existential. As judges of the World Court, you possess the power to help us course correct and renew hope in humanity's ability to address the greatest challenge of our time. And you can do this simply by applying international law to the conduct responsible for climate change. Palahenga, Chiana, and thank you.
I thank the representatives of Vanuatu and the Melanesian Spearhead Group for their presentation. Before I invite the next delegation to take the floor, the court will observe a break of 15 minutes. the hearing is suspended.
Friends, before continuing, please support, like and comment on this video, and don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. God bless us all.